All right, let's jump right into this explainer because today we're looking at something absolutely wild. We are diving into a highly unusual, incredibly high stakes intellectual debate over literally the ultimate prize in physics, a theory of everything. Now, what makes this specific explainer so fascinating is that we're analyzing a raw, unedited conversation between an independent human theorist named Arndt Michael Meyer and an artificial intelligence. They're going head to head over Arndt's deeply radical emergent physics framework called the NKE theory. It is this passionate, sometimes intensely frustrating clash of paradigms, and it brings up some truly profound questions about how actual scientific breakthroughs happen in the age of AI.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for the explainer. First, we've got the holy grail of physics. Second, the NKI theory itself. Third, man versus machine. Fourth, the math problem. And finally, who solves the puzzle?
Part 1. The Holy Grail of Physics, Resurrecting the TOE.
Now, you might be wondering, is this topic really that important? Well, to understand why this matters so much, we have to talk about a theory of everything, or TOE. This is a single framework that explains literally all physics, right from the tiniest quantum particles all the way up to the massive forces of gravity. Mainstream science kind of abandoned this search about a century ago. But Arndt Michael Meyer states his ambition using this fantastic metaphor. He argues that for 100 years, physicists have basically just been building better navigation systems, meaning they make mathematical models that calculate outcomes perfectly, without actually understanding the asphalt and the wind, the real, fundamental physical reality of how the universe operates. And he wants to resurrect the search for a complete, bottom-up theory. That metaphor perfectly captures the philosophical divide at the core of this whole discussion. On one side, we have the established Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. That essentially says, shut up and calculate. It focuses entirely on calculating outcomes without strictly defining the underlying physical foundation. But then on the other side, we have this radical new ambition to build a theory where the entire universe, forces, particles, the whole shebang, logically emerges from absolute nothingness. It's a complete 180-degree rejection of the mainstream approach. Part 2, the NKE theory. Nothing, crust, something. So, what exactly is this radical new approach? The bedrock of the NKE framework, which stands for nothing, crust, something, is what the author calls the Busfo process. This is defined as an infinite, self-reinforcing, virtual separation that occurs entirely within absolute nothingness. Now, I know that sounds incredibly dense, but think of it this way. Instead of the universe starting with a giant explosion like a Big Bang, this theory argues that a continuous, linear structuring process is constantly happening everywhere, all the time. In this model, you don't even need supernovae to forge heavy elements. The Busfo process just creates structure continuously from the bottom up. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the NKE theory completely redefines the four fundamental forces of nature. It views them not as separate, distinct forces, but as emergent phenomena arising out of that underlying Busfo process. Gravity, that becomes the Mitzi effect, which is basically a pull-along effect created by existing structure. Electromagnetism is simply the interaction of oscillating structures. The weak nuclear force is redefined as just a measure of stability, and the strong nuclear force is literally just the energy required to destroy a stable resonance. It is a completely unified, almost acoustic-like view of reality. Part 3. Man versus machine, the friction of discovery. Having a unified theory in your head is one thing, right? But testing it with an AI is a completely different beast. And it really shows us just how good and how intense this conversation gets. You can see exactly why dynamic friction occurs when you compare how they both approach the problem. The AI is completely bound by its training data. It represents the standard model of physics. So when the human says, hey, there was no Big Bang, the AI immediately pushes back. It demands empirical proof, asking things like how this new theory explains the incredibly uniform 2.725 Kelvin cosmic microwave background radiation. The human, meanwhile, relies on logical deduction and paradigm-breaking philosophical grounding. This creates massive emotional friction because taking a radical, newborn idea and feeding it to a system strictly trained on established science is just incredibly difficult. And honestly, that friction boils over multiple times in the source material. At one point, the author expresses some serious frustration, telling the AI it's constantly being pulled into the black hole of the mainstream. As an impartial observer reading this, It's pretty clear that the author isn't looking for a conventional fact-checker here. He is desperately seeking a proactive brainstorming partner, someone or something that can step outside the standard model and help build the internal logic of this new theory without constantly throwing up roadblocks from the old theory.
Which naturally brings us to a huge question. What specific skills do you actually need to develop, or even just to read and comprehend a theory like this? Well, the skills required are absolutely immense. First off, you need extreme mental endurance and resilience against mainstream pushback, just like we saw with the AI. You need completely out-of-the-box logical deduction to follow emergent ideas all the way from nothingness up to physical matter. You need a deep, incredibly broad knowledge of physics just to know what phenomena, like neutrinos or supernovae, even need explaining in the first place. And above all else, you need a profound willingness to question dogmatic rules that have stood firm for a century.
Part 4. The math problem. Calculating the incalculable.
So the crucial point is, even if you have all those skills, there is a massive mathematical hurdle standing right in the way of the NLK theory. It asks a critical, maybe even the most important question: is what the author is attempting even mathematically possible? See, he hypothesizes that because particles are essentially stable resonances or standing waves in his theory, we should be able to model element masses using a three-dimensional Fourier analysis. A Fourier analysis is a mathematical tool used to break down really complex waves into simple sine waves. But the AI points out that while a 3D Fourier analysis does mathematically exist, applying it to the three-dimensional, phase-shifted reality of actual atomic elements is phenomenally complex. In fact, it has never been successfully done to predict element masses. So, will mainstream scientists actually participate and help calculate this? You can kind of see why they might hesitate, right? The NKE theory views elements as simple acoustic-like standing waves formed by constructive interference, but traditional physicists don't view the atomic nucleus as a standard oscillating medium at all. They use entirely different mathematical tools to get their answers, like quantum shell models and spin-orbit coupling. Convincing highly specialized physicists to completely abandon their incredibly precise tools just to attempt an unproven 3D Fourier analysis on a brand new foundational theory, well, that is a towering challenge.
To really put that challenge into perspective, just look at this number, 100,000. During the conversation, the author points out that roughly 100,000 brilliant physicists over the last century have tried and failed to calculate a theory of everything. That really highlights the staggering odds of one single person, even if they have the perfect logic, calculating all the math completely alone. He readily acknowledges that he needs experts to do the math, but the experts are entirely tied to the mainstream models. It's an absolutely profound catch-22.
Part 5. Who solves the puzzle? The roles of AI and humans.
Let's move to and see how this builds into solving the ultimate puzzle. Who actually solves something this complex? This conversation paints a remarkably clear picture of what the ultimate partnership for paradigm shifts might look like. The author realizes he simply cannot read thousands of physics books to manually retrieve every single data point needed to validate his theory. He absolutely needs AI, whether that's Grok, DeepSeek, Notebook LM, you name it. But the roles have to be strictly defined. Humans have to provide the fantasy, the resilience, and that initial gravity-defying leap of logic. The AI is there to provide flawless data retrieval and act as a logical sounding board. But, and this is a huge but, for this to work on truly novel physics, the human must carefully prompt the AI to temporarily ignore its mainstream bias. Otherwise, it just rejects the new logic immediately. Ultimately, this leaves us with an incredibly provocative thought. On one hand, we have human theorists who can dream up incredible, emergent logic from absolute nothingness, but they lack the raw mathematical processing power to prove it alone. On the other hand, we have AIs that hold the entirety of human scientific data, but are completely trapped by the very training data that makes them smart in the first place. So, the big question remains, can a true human-AI partnership eventually grasp a theory of everything? Or are the limits of our biological intuition, combined with the rigid biases of our artificial data, still keeping both of us just too far away from the ultimate truth? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I'll catch you next time.